Short Lives of the Dominican Saints, Part 7. May 12th. Blessed Jane of Portugal, Virgin, 1452 to 1490. King Alfonso V of Portugal, grieved at having no children, went as a private pilgrim to a much-frequented church in the diocese of Lamego, dedicated to Saint Dominic, earnestly begging of God to grant him an heir to his crown. The following year the queen gave birth to a daughter, who was destined one day to wear the Dominican habit and who received in baptism the name of Jane. The states of the kingdom assembled at the king's desire and solemnly swore allegiance to the infant princess in case no male heir should be born to inherit the crown. 3 years later, however, a prince was born, who afterwards ascended the throne as John II, and shortly after his birth the two royal children had the misfortune to lose their mother. The king entrusted the princess to the care of a noble and virtuous lady by name of Doña Beatrix de Menezes, who trained her in habits of solid virtue and piety. The childhood of the little Jane was indeed wholly consecrated to God, and, as she grew up, she daily aimed at a yet closer union with him, whom she already had chosen as the spouse of her soul. Despising all the flatteries and allurements of the court, she constructed a little oratory, where she endeavored to hide herself from the gaze of the world and to spend every moment she could call her own in prayer. The king, who had formed great designs for the princess, was careful to have her instructed in everything that benefited her station, and it was with excessive pain and reluctance that she found herself compelled to leave her chosen solitude in order to learn dancing and singing and other worldly accomplishments. It was by no means easy for her to pursue the life of penance and devotion to which she felt herself called, secure from the notice of the court. She selected, however, 2 of her ladies-in-waiting, who, like herself, were earnestly striving after perfection, together with an old and very pious knight in her father's service, and, with their assistance, she gave abundant alms to the bashful poor, and procured for herself coarse woolen underclothing and a rough hair-shirt, which she constantly wore beneath her royal robes. She slept on the bare ground, with a log for her pillow, and spent great part of the night in prayer and penitential exercises. She had a tender devotion to the Passion of Christ, and caused a representation of the crown of thorns to be added to her heraldic arms. At the age of 16, she sought the king's permission to enter a poor and recently founded convent of Dominicanesses at Aveiro, which was said to be the strictest and most fervent in all Portugal. Her request was met by an absolute refusal, and for a time she was compelled outwardly to acquiesce in this decision. Shortly afterwards, however, her father and brother set out on an expedition against the Moors in Africa, leaving Jane to govern the kingdom in their absence. This she continued to do with consummate prudence until their triumphant return, when she resolved to take advantage of the joyful meeting to throw herself at her father's feet and extort his consent to her long-desired retirement of the world. Alfonso did not refuse, and she accordingly took up her abode in the convent of her choice, when in the 20th year of her age. She could not, however, take the habit until the consent of the states of the kingdom had been obtained, and this was delayed for no less than 3 years. At the end of that time, the princess took the bold steps of acting without their leave, and was accordingly clothed, to the great joy of the community, on the feast of the conversion of St. Paul in 1475. Her trials, however, were not yet over. No sooner was it known that she had taken the habit than the whole kingdom, and, as it would seem, all the powers of hell leagued together against the poor novice. The court wore mourning, as if for her death. A message from the king demanded that she should be given up to him, and the prioress and the community were threatened with the severest penalties should they fail to obey. The prince, her brother, forced his way into the convent and even into her cell, and threatened to tear the habit from her back and cut it into 1,000 pieces. This war of tongues continued with unabated violence for some time, but, strange to say, was never suffered to proceed to action. At length there was a temporary cessation, and the princess was for a while left free to devote herself with renewed fervor to the life of prayer and penance which she had chosen. She delighted in the humblest exercises of the religious state, sweeping, washing, carrying wood, and waiting on the sick in the infirmary. In order to be like the other sisters in all things, she learned to spin and to sew, and attained great perfection in these arts, so that it became her privilege to spin the linen thread from which the corporals were to be made. She also employed herself in the manufacture of disciplines and hair shirts. She had a wonderful gift for consoling those among her sisters who were suffering from interior trials, and by her burning words and the prayers and mortifications which she offered on their behalf, she often obtained their deliverance. Blessed Jane's profession was long deferred, and her family constantly pressed her to accept one or other of the royal suitors who sought her hand for themselves or their respective heirs. The death of Louis XI of France in the year 1483, and of Richard III of England 2 years later, delivered her from this vexatious persecution, and though she dared not take the solemn vow of religion in the face of the determined opposition of the kingdom, she at length ventured to bind herself by simple vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Her course was a shining one, but of short duration. In the year 1489, her health, which had long been failing, entirely gave way. No remedy availed to bring relief. The only thing which seems to assuage her sufferings was drinking cold water, and this the physicians forbade her to do, so that she suffered, like her divine spouse, from a continual and tormenting thirst. On Christmas Eve she insisted on being present at the solemn chanting of the Martyrology, and on Good Friday of the following year caused her to be carried to the choir to take part in the adoration of the cross, and during the other ceremonies of Holy Week, at which her weaknesses would not permit her to assist. She begged the sisters to leave the doors open, that she might at least catch the distant sound of the chant. On Easter Sunday she communicated in the choir, and, before leaving it, gazed long and lovingly on the stalls, as though grieved at the thought that she would never again sing God's praises there in the company of her sisters. During her illness, Blessed Jane had the great fear of death, and struck her breast continually, saying, "I have sinned, O Lord, have mercy on me." Then, devoutly clasping the crucifix in her hands, she would add, "Turn away thy face from thy sins." But this fear in no way diminished her confidence in her divine spouse. The end came at last on May 12th, 1490. As the sisters praying around her came to the words in the litany, "All ye holy innocents, pray for her," the faithful spouse of Christ breathed forth her pure soul to God. Her glory was manifested by many wonderful visions and miracles, and Pope Innocent XII gave permission for her festival to be celebrated in the Kingdom of Portugal and the Order of St. Dominic. May 13th. Blessed Albert of Bergamo, Confessor, 1279. Blessed Albert was born of poor and virtuous parents in the little town of Villa d'Ogna, near Bergamo in Italy. When only 7 years old, he began to practice penance and charity, fasting 3 days in the week and giving the food which he deprived himself to the poor. His childhood and youth were spent in innocence, and yet he practiced severe austerities. During his hard labor in the fields, he kept himself in continual recollection of spirit, making use of all the sights and sounds of nature, as so many steps to raise up his mind and heart to God. In obedience to the wishes of his father, he married a young peasant girl, with whom he lived for many years in perfect concord. She even began to imitate him in his exercises of piety. But, on the death of his father, her dispositions underwent a sudden change, and thenceforth she became a continual trial to him. She would bitterly reproach him for wasting, as she expressed it, so much of his time in prayer, as well as for his profuse liberality with the poor. In this latter respect, it must be owned, Blessed Albert's conduct was somewhat trying, as he would occasionally give away the very dinner which had been prepared for themselves and their laborers. More than once, however, God made good the loss by miracle, and the holy man, by his unalterable sweetness, patience, and silence, under this vexatious domestic persecution, doubtless gained for himself a great treasure of merits. Some powerful nobles, having seized his little property, Albert, who by this time had become a widower, left the neighborhood and settled in Cremona, where he earned for himself the title of the diligent laborer. God was sometimes pleased to reveal the sanctity of his servant by miracles. Angels in human form came to help him in his work, thus enabling him to increase his earnings, almost the whole of which he distributed to the needy. One day he was carrying a barrel of wine to the house of a poor woman, when it accidentally slipped from his shoulder and broke to pieces on the road. "King of glory, come to my assistance," exclaimed the holy man, according to his wont in all difficulties. Then he collected the broken pieces of wood, adjusted them in their proper places, and collected the spilt wine with his hand so as not a drop was lost. Not content with bestowing on the poor all that he could spare from his wages, he often solicited alms on their behalf. His lodgings were near the Dominican convent, and he placed himself under the direction of the fathers, and received the habit as a tertiary. Thenceforth he devoted his time and strength almost entirely to the service of the sick poor, visiting them, rendering them the lowliest services, assisting them by his prayers in the last agony, and accompanying their remains to the grave, even succeeding in founding a hospital. Blessed Albert exercised himself in the works of charity for a long time, until he understood it to be the will of God that he should undertake the life of a pilgrim, in which he spent several years. He is said to have visited the Holy Land once, the sanctuaries of Spain, and in particular St. James of Compostela, 8 times, and Rome 9 times. He traveled in silence, wrapped in meditation, or beguiling the monotony of the way by singing hymns or reciting psalms. And he may be said to have faithfully observed the precept of praying always. As he was returning to Cremona after these pilgrimages, and was already almost at the gates of the city, he had to cross the river Po. The ferryman rudely refused to admit him into his boat without payment, and the servant of God had no money. Then Blessed Albert cast his mantle upon the waters, and embarking upon it reached the opposite bank in safety. Having settled down once more in the home of his adoption, he devoted himself especially to the service of poor pilgrims. In spite of his own extreme poverty, he lodged them under his roof, waited upon them with the same reverence he would have rendered to Christ himself, conducted them to all the sanctuaries of the city, and gave them an alms to enable them to continue their journey. At length, worn out by his labors, he fell sick and asked for the last sacraments. The priest delaying to come, the bread of angels is said to have been brought to him by a white dove, which suddenly appeared in his room. Clasping his crucifix in his hands and covering it with kisses, he breathed forth his soul to his Creator on the 7th of May, 1279, being in the 65th, or, according to some writers, the 75th year of his age. When preparations were made for his interment in the cemetery, it was found impossible to penetrate the earth, so that it became necessary to carry the sacred remains to the church, where, beneath the very spot where the holy man had been wont to pray, a vault was found ready prepared, of the existence of which no one had previously been aware. Here the body was laid with great honor, the bishop himself performing the funeral service. Benedict XIV approved the immemorial veneration paid to Blessed Albert, and gave permission for Mass and office to be celebrated in his honor in the Dominican order, and by the clergy of the diocese of Bergamo and Cremona. May 14th. Blessed Egidius, or Giles of Portugal, Confessor, 1183 to 1265. Egidius, or Giles, Rodriguez, was born of noble parents in Vozela in Portugal about 1183. His family destined him for the ecclesiastical state and sent him for his education to Coimbra, where he became eminent as a philosopher and devoted himself to the study of medicine. Several rich benefices had been obtained for him, but the young man entirely neglected his sacred obligations and even entered into an unholy compact with Satan, which he signed with his own blood. For 7 years he is said to have studied magic in the caves of Toledo under his infernal master. When he reappeared amongst men, he was found to be endowed with a marvelous power over the elements and able to cure the most inveterate diseases. He took his degree at Paris as a doctor in medicine and established his reputation by numerous and striking cures, evidently surpassing human power, whilst his life was one of unbridled iniquity. But God in his infinite mercy had decreed to change this unhappy slave of the devil into one of his own most faithful and loving servants. One night, as Egidius was pursuing his unholy studies with the doors locked upon him, an armed horseman of gigantic stature suddenly appeared before him, and, shaking his lance, exclaimed in terrific accents, "Change thy life! Change thy life, I tell thee!" The vision disappeared, and the trembling Egidius cast a remorseful glance on the miserable past. But his bad habits soon regained the mastery. Then the fearful apparition came a second time, charged full upon the unhappy sinner, and hurled him to the ground, exclaiming thrice, "Change thy life, or I will slay thee." "I will change, Lord, I will change. Pardon my delay," faltered the miserable man. He rose an altered being. His first act was to consign all his books of magic to the flames. He then set out for Spain, took the habit of a friar preacher in the newly founded convent of Palencia about 1220, and fervently entered upon a course of penance and devotion. But for 7 years, the same term as that of his unholy apprenticeship to Satan, no comfort came to his anguished soul. Terrifying visions of demons continually assailed him, and the thought of the contract signed with his own blood in binding him to the evil one filled him with fear and remorse. Yet he persevered in prayer and penance, continually commending himself to her who is the refuge of sinners, and who is never invoked in vain. One night, when he was exposed to the most terrible assaults of the demons, the paper of his contract was suddenly and violently thrown on the ground before him, and an infernal voice cried aloud that Mary had conquered. Egidius took the bond, felt himself freed from his sufferings, and for the first time tasted the consolations of a soul perfectly at rest. From that time he became as distinguished for his holiness and his seraphic love of God as he had formerly been for his apostasy and rebellion. He bore in particular a most tender devotion to the holy name of Jesus, the mere casual utterance of which had the power to cast him into ecstasy. He became one of the most celebrated religious of his time, and was more than once provincial of the order in Spain. His miracles were very numerous, and his power over the evil spirits who had so long and so cruelly tyrannized over him was exhibited in many wonderful ways. One of his favorite maxims was that we must forget ourselves in the service of our neighbor, that the salvation of souls must take precedence of all private devotions. There is something singularly attractive in the picture which is left of us of the life and practices of this wonderful man. He would take advantage of the time when the brethren were in the schools to clean and tidy their cells for them, and would render the lowliest services to the sick. Being naturally of a cheerful and loquacious disposition, he found extreme difficulty in practicing the rule of silence. But, understanding this to be a temptation of the devil, he resolved to live in strict retirement in his cell, and so generously did he overcome himself in this manner, that thenceforth he was hardly ever heard to utter a useless word. If anyone needed his help, he would at once lay aside his own occupation and hasten with a joyful countenance to render the desired service. His whole bearing attracted souls to the love of the order and to the practice of poverty and obedience. He was ever ready to console the tempted and to render the humblest services to the sick brethren. When the hour of his death drew nigh, he caused a haircloth to be stretched upon the ground, and extending himself upon it, received the last sacraments and spoke words of consolation to his weeping brethren. Then he raised his hands to heaven, saying, Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. After which, stretching forth his arms in the form of a cross, without agony, he happily departed this life on the Feast of the Ascension in 1265. Benedict XIV approved the veneration which had always been paid to Blessed Egidius in the Dominican order and the Kingdom of Portugal. May 20th. Blessed Columba of Rieti, Virgin, 1468 to 1501. Blessed Columba was born of humble parents at Rieti in Italy, probably in 1468. She received in baptism the name of Angela, but as she was held at the font, a white dove suddenly appeared, and after flying 3 times around the baptistry, settled on the infant's head, and thenceforth she was always called by the name of Columba, dove. Her saintliness of disposition was manifested even from her infancy. When barely 3 years old, she secretly strewed thorns over her little bed, and when only a little older, she took the discipline with severity and endeavored to fast on Fridays on bread and water, and to go barefoot. As soon as she had learnt the Hail Mary, she placed herself especially under Our Lady's protection, and at the age of 12 consecrated herself to God by a vow of virginity. She became very intimate with a congregation of nuns of the Third Order of St. Dominic, then established at Rieti, and under their guidance made rapid progress in the saintly sciences of mortification and prayer. Her parents were desirous of giving her in marriage, and had even fixed the day for her betrothal, when Columba was instructed by a heavenly vision to imitate the example of St. Catherine of Siena. Interpreting this to signify the cutting off of her hair, she instantly obeyed, and entering the room where her parents and the intended bridegroom with his friends were awaiting her, she flung her hair contemptuously on the ground, and declared her unalterable resolution to remain the spouse of Christ alone. After some further persecution, she was at length permitted to follow the way of life to which God so strongly called her, and entered upon a course from the very thought of which nature recoils. Thrice every night she disciplined herself to blood. She seemed to live in prayer, and her fast, with the short interruptions of some of the greater festivals, was perpetual. The fame of her sanctity induced a Spanish bishop to journey from Rome to Rieti in order to see her. He recognized her in church by the appearance of a bright star which shone above her head, and instructed and consoled her, recommending her to practice very frequent communion and to make much use of the 90th Psalm. One day, when Columba was about 19, she beheld in vision the 3 holy founders, Saint Benedict, Saint Francis, and Saint Dominic, each inviting her to assume the habit of his order. But Columba's choice had not long ago been made, and she looked lovingly at the father of the friars preachers, who immediately claimed her for his own by throwing around her his mantle, whence exhaled a heavenly fragrance. After this she received the habit of the third order from the hands of the prior of the Dominican convent at Rieti on Palm Sunday. Her raptures, miracles, and prophecies were rendering her very famous, when God made known to her in 1488 that he desired her to leave her native city. She was brought in a mysterious manner to Perugia, where a convent was built for her at the public expense, and where she made her solemn profession on Whit Sunday in 1490. In less than 2 years she had gathered around her a community of 50 members, whom she governed with great charity and prudence, though it was long before she could be induced to accept the title of prioress. When the plague visited the town of Perugia, Columba begged that the people might be spared and the wrath of God vented on herself, and her prayer was answered by a 9 days' visitation of a most terrible malady. By her advice, the inhabitants earnestly besought St. Dominic and St. Catherine to take the city under their protection. Public processions were made, and the scourge ceased its ravages. In the summer of 1495, Pope Alexander VI visited Perugia, and at his desire Columba was brought before him. Scarcely had she touched the hem of his garment than she fell into an ecstasy and remained for a long time motionless at his feet. On recovering the use of her senses, she was subjected to a searching examination in the presence of the pontiff, who professed himself entirely satisfied with the result, and granted her many favors. 2 years later she had an awful vision regarding the state of the Church and the chastisements which threatened Italy, of which she sent an account to the confessor of Alexander VI, at the same time uttering bitter reproaches against those who had brought such a disgrace upon the spouse of Christ. Columba's life was one of severe bodily mortification, and was deeply seamed and scarred with the marks of the cross of her divine bridegroom. Distrust, reproaches, injuries, and the blackest calumnies were heaped upon her. She was even deprived of her confessor. Her bodily sufferings from excruciating toothache and other painful disorders were extreme, but though the pain sometimes drew tears from her eyes, she endured it all with unalterable sweetness and patience, saying that our Lord is amiable everywhere and under all circumstances, but that it is on the cross that he shows himself the most loving of friends. Some months before her death, St. Dominic appeared to her, saying, "Rejoice, my daughter. The hour is at hand when thou shalt be forever united to thy spouse." After the servant of God had undergone a long and painful illness, this happy hour came at length on the eve of the Ascension, on May 20th, 1501. The Passion of our Lord was read to her at her own request, and at the words, "He gave up the ghost," she once more commended her soul to God, our Blessed Lady, St. Dominic, and St. Catherine. my spouse," she repeated. "Come, it is now time. Receive thy servant, Lord, my sweet Lord, receive." As she pronounced the last word, she calmly breathed forth her soul to God. At the moment of her death she appeared in great glory to another beatified saint of the order, Blessed Osana of Mantua. Blessed Columba worked many miracles during her lifetime, and many more were vouchsafed after her death through her intercession. She was beatified by Urban VIII. May 22nd. Saint Servatius, Bishop and Confessor, Protector of the Dominican Order, 384. Saint Servatius was of noble birth, and was renowned alike for his learning and sanctity. He became Bishop of Tongres in Belgium, which then formed part of Gaul, and in that capacity assisted at the Council of Sardica, where he strenuously defended the Catholic faith against the Arians. He likewise stoutly resisted these heretics at the Council of Rimini, and labored to prevent the ill consequences which threatened the Church through their frauds and the weakness of the bishops. Being sent by the tyrant Magnentius, together with Saint Maximum, Bishop of Treves, an ambassador to the Emperor Constantius, he was honorably entertained by Saint Athanasius at Alexandria. Saint Gregory of Tours states that Saint Servatius foretold the invasion of Gaul by the Huns, and implored the divine mercy by watching, fasting, prayers, and many tears to avert so great a calamity from the flock entrusted to his care. For his intention he undertook a penitential pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Peter in Rome. As he was weeping and praying there, the prince of the apostles appeared to him and thus addressed him, "Wherefore dost thou importune me? The Lord has decreed that the Huns should enter Gaul and lay it waste in a terrible manner. Take my counsel, therefore. Lose no time. Set thy house in order, prepare thy grave, make ready a clean winding sheet. Behold, thou shalt depart this life, and thou shalt not witness the evils which the Huns are to bring upon Gaul, as the Lord our God hath spoken." The holy bishop, therefore, returned in all haste to his diocese, and with many tears imparted the sad tidings to his broken-hearted flock. "Holy Father, do not abandon us," they exclaimed. "Good Shepherd, forget us not." Very shortly afterwards he fell ill, as St. Peter had foretold, and closed his saintly life by a holy death on the 13th of May, 384, after an episcopate of 37 years. It is recorded that when all the country round was white with snow, his tomb at Maastricht always remained free from it until the time when a church was raised over his holy remains. Saint Servatius was declared protector of the Dominican order in consequence of the following circumstances. In the 14th century, the Church and the order were suffering bitter persecution from the schismatical emperor Louis of Bavaria. Learning that the general chapter was convoked to meet in his dominions at the city of Cologne, 1330, this prince secretly plotted the death of the capitular fathers. They had just assembled when Saint Servatius appeared in a dream to one of their number, a very holy religious, warned him of the danger which threatened himself and his brethren, and bade them flee to Maastricht. This they accordingly did, thus escaping the snares which had been laid for them. And though their coming to Maastricht was wholly unexpected, God disposed the hearts of the inhabitants to receive them with the utmost kindness. In gratitude for this providential intervention, the fathers decreed that the festival of Saint Servatius should henceforth be celebrated in the order to the end of time. But as it was first instituted only under the rite of a feast of 3 lessons, the great increase of festivals of higher rank caused it, after the lapse of years, to fall into disuse. To preserve the memory of so great a benefit, the Fathers, therefore, obtained permission from Pope Leo XII that the festival of Saint Servatius should be henceforth celebrated throughout the entire order with the rank of a totum duplex, or greater double. May 23rd. Blessed Louis Mary Grignon de Montfort, Confessor, 1673 to 1716. Louis Mary Grignon, called de Montfort from the place of his birth, was born in Brittany of poor but pious parents of noble family in the year 1673. In his youth he delighted in inducing his little sister and her companions to recite the rosary, encouraging them to the practice by small presents, and after going through his studies at Jesuit College at Rennes, he repaired to Paris for his theological course and entered the seminary of Saint Sulpice. Here his entire disregard of human respect and his practices of piety drew upon him many painful and humiliating trials, whilst his perfect obedience secured him from every illusion. Having been ordained priest, he returned to the west of France, and devoted himself to missionary labors. After a time he went on pilgrimage to Rome, and entreated the Pope to send him to preach the gospel in the East. But the Holy Father assured him that God called him not to foreign missions, but to combat the errors of the day in his own country. The remainder of his life was entirely consecrated to evangelizing the western provinces of France, where, in the space of 12 years, he gave more than 200 retreats and missions. Wherever he preached, he established the confraternity of the Holy Rosary, making arrangements, if possible, for its daily recital. He had a great taste for drawing and painting, but, from a spirit of mortification, or for fear of distracting himself from the presence of God, he early made an entire sacrifice of this, his favorite recreation. His great gift for poetry was wholly used in the service of his divine master, and many of the most popular hymns still used in France were written by him. In 1710 he made his profession in the Third Order of St. Dominic in the convent of friars preachers at Nantes, and, like his Holy Father, he continually strove to draw down the blessings of God on his apostolic labors by the practice of the severest penances. He was an object of hatred to the Jansenists, who at that time were insidiously spreading their errors in France. In many places they contrived to poison the minds of the bishops against the servant of God by cruel calumnies, and suffering and humiliations were his lifelong portion. On one occasion, when, after 15 months' labor, he had almost completed the erection of a gigantic Calvary at a place called Pontchâteau, in the Diocese of Nantes, he was suddenly forbidden to proceed with the undertaking, found himself banished from the diocese, and beheld the work which had cost him so much labor destroyed by the hands of the militia of the district. In this bitter trial he saw nothing but the accomplishment of the holy will of God. God be blessed, he said tranquilly. God be blessed. I did not seek my own glory, but only the glory of God. I hope to receive from him the same reward as if I had succeeded. At La Rochelle, the Calvinists, irritated by the many conversions which the holy man had effected, attempted to poison him, and he suffered from the effects of the drought during the rest of his life. Blessed Louis founded schools and hospitals, and everywhere labored for the restoration of the churches, which were at that time in a very dilapidated state. He entered missionaries to continue his work under the title of the Society of Mary, a congregation of religious women called the Daughters of Wisdom, and a pious association called Brethren of the Holy Ghost. Worn out by his labors and penances, the servant of God continued to devote himself to preaching till within a few days of his death, which took place on April 28th, 1716, when he was only 43 years of age. He was beatified by Pope Leo XIII on the occasion of his sacerdotal jubilee in 1888. May 25th. Translation of the relics of our Holy Father, St. Dominic, in 1233. The body of the Holy Patriarch, St. Dominic, had been laid to rest, according to his own desire, in the church of St. Nicholas at Bologna, beneath the feet of his brethren, and, in spite of continual prodigies and genuine favors granted to the faithful who prayed day and night at his tomb, his children allowed the sacred deposit to remain under the plain flagstone originally laid over it, and took no steps for obtaining his canonization. Lest they should be thought to be seeking their own emolument under the appearance of piety, the friars even broke and threw away the votive offerings brought by some people, and would not permit any exterior marks of devotion to be exhibited. It was necessity which at length compelled them to undertake the first translation of the sacred relics. The ever-increasing numbers of the community obliged them to enlarge the convent, and to pull down the old church and build a new and more spacious one. To do this, the tomb of St. Dominic would have to be disturbed. They accordingly applied for the requisite permission to Pope Gregory IX, who was no other than the saint's old friend, Cardinal Ugolino. He joyfully granted the petition, at the same time administering a sharp rebuke to the friars for their long negligence. The solemn translation accordingly took place on Whit Tuesday, May 24th, 1233, during the general chapter, which was held that year at Bologna. The Pope wished to have attended in person, but being prevented from doing so, he deputed the Archbishop of Ravenna to represent him, in company with a number of other distinguished prelates. 300 friars preachers from all countries assembled to assist at this function, not without a secret fear on the part of some as to the state in which the sacred remains might be found, as they long had been exposed to rain and heat, owing to the dilapidated condition of the church. The opening of the tomb took place before daybreak, in the presence of Blessed Jordan, then Master General of the Order, and the Fathers of the Chapter, together with the bishops, prelates, and magistrates who were to assist at the ceremony. All stood round in silence whilst the procurator, Father Rodolphe of Faenza, raised the stone. Hardly had he begun to remove the earth and mortar that lay beneath than an extraordinary odor became perceptible, which increased in power and sweetness as they dug deeper, until at length, when the coffin appeared and was lifted out of the grave, the whole church was filled with the perfume as though from a burning of some rich and precious gums. The bystanders knelt on the pavement, shedding tears of emotion as the lid was raised, and the sacred remains, now reduced to bones, were exposed to their eyes. It was the Master General who raised the body of his beloved father and reverently laid it in a new coffin. The faithful were then admitted, and the Archbishop of Ravenna sang the Mass of the day, whilst the fragrance diffused from the open coffin flooded the whole of the sacred edifice. Blessed Jordan, in his circular letter to the order, thus describes the solemn function. As the choir intoned the introit, receive the joy of your glory, giving thanks to God, who has called you to the celestial kingdom, the brethren in their gladness of heart took the words as if spoken from heaven. The trumpets sounded. The people displayed a countless multitude of tapers, and, as the procession moved along, there everywhere resounded the words, Blessed be Jesus Christ. He goes on to speak of the vast number of miraculous graces which were poured forth both before and after the ceremony. Sight, he says, was granted to the blind, power of walking to the lame, soundness to the paralyzed, speech to the dumb. I myself saw Nicholas, an Englishman, who had long been paralyzed, leaping at this solemnity. The coffin was then laid in the marble tomb prepared for it, but 8 days later, to satisfy the devotion of some distinguished persons who had not been present on the previous occasion, the holy remains were again exposed to view. Then it was that Blessed Jordan, taking the sacred head between his hands, kissed it, while tears of tenderness flowed from his eyes, and so holding it, he desired all the fathers of the chapter to approach and gaze at it for the last time. One by one they came and kissed the venerable relics. All were conscious of the same extraordinary fragrance. It remained on the hands and clothes of those who touched or came near the body. Nor was this the case merely when the grave was first opened. The tomb remained unclosed for 15 days, during which interval it was guarded by officers appointed by the city magistrates, and all this time the same exquisite odor was sensible to all who visited the spot. And Flamimus, who lived 300 years later, thus writes, in 1527, this divine odor adheres to the relics even to the present day. A second translation of St. Dominic's relics took place in the year 1267, when the holy body was removed to a more richly ornamented tomb. This translation, like the first, was made at the time of the general chapter, and the head of the saint, after being devoutly kissed by the brethren and several bishops who were present, was exposed to the veneration of the people from a lofty stage erected outside the church of St. Nicholas. The tomb was again opened in 1383, when a portion of the head was placed in a silver reliquary, in order the more easily to satisfy the devotion of the faithful. Finally, in 1469, The remains of the saint were deposited in the magnificently sculptured shrine in which they now rest, which is regarded as the masterpiece of Nicholas Pisano.